welcome back into Cherry Picking. Today's video, we're looking at 7 players to drop in your fantasy hockey league before the All-Star break, either during the All-Star break or when players come back from action from that little break that they have going on next week. But yeah, 7 players that have really been underperforming the last 30 days. Some of these guys, pretty much all of them, more than 30% rostered. So this should give you value in pretty much any type of league that you're in. Some of them have like stipulations or asterisks around them, considering if you're in a dynasty league or not. But here are 7 players that you need to drop right now that are just wasting a spot on your roster. All right, so the first guy we're going to be looking at here is actually Benn on the Dallas Stars, 71% roster. But listen to these stats over the last 30 days. Last 30 days, tied 145th in points amongst forwards with 7 points in his last 16 games played. That's the same amount of points as someone like Jason Zucker, Alex Killorn, Jordan Martinook. None of those guys are rostered on your fantasy hockey team, let's be honest. He's a -4 in January as well, and this is probably the most alarming part. But the Stars are 7-4-2, 6th best record since the start of January. So he's playing right now on the third line with Sam Steele and Joe Pavelski. Definitely a new lineup here that DeBoer is trying. You know, Wyatt Johnson up on that top line, taking Pavelski's spot. He's also playing the fewest minutes we've seen since his rookie year, playing less than 15 minutes per game. He's also averaging less than 2 shots on goal per game too. So Benn has kind of lost his role in this Dallas Stars offense. You know, you saw it a little bit last year with him and Seguin. Seguin's having a little bit of a better year, but really not by that much of a stretch there. So Benn, 71% rostered, regardless, a guy you can definitely draw. All right, the next guy we're going to be looking at, and I've talked to this guy in sell high videos, and now he really doesn't have any sell high value, and that's Shayne Gostisbehere on the Detroit Red Wings. You know, pretty solid season for sure, 7 goals and 25 assists, but looking at his more recent play over the last 2 months, and then specifically over the last 30 days, tied 40th in points amongst defensemen with no goals and 7 assists. Not terrible, but if you're in leagues that count hits and block shots and even shots on goal, he's 117th in hits over his last 30 days amongst defensemen, 151st in block shots. So he is very point dependent if you have Ghost on your roster. He's also a -10 in his last 14 games played. How can you trust a defenseman to go out there and play consistent minutes if you know 1 or 2 of the shifts that he's on the ice, there's going to be a goal scored against? You know, right now in Yahoo Fantasy Hockey Leagues, he ranks outside the top 300 in terms of fantasy points scored. He's barely playing 19 minutes per game this month. Had a game where he actually played just 12 minutes, and that was in a win. How can you convince Derek Lalonde that even during a win or in a loss, you're going to continue to play this guy 19 minutes per game? I think we'll continue to see his ice time dwindle here as the Red Wings continue to vie for a playoff spot, but his role has really diminished on this Red Wings team as they try to focus a little bit more on a defensive heavy scheme, considering their goalie situation this season and just the rate of this team and how they're playing. One other thing to note, Detroit has the 12th hardest remaining schedule in the NHL. So Shayne Gostisbehere, a guy that was really good at the beginning of the season, but you can definitely let him loose now. He has pretty much no trade value. All right, the next guy, and I've talked about this guy as well, and honestly, I was just completely wrong of how I think he turned around his season, and that's Tom Wilson on the Washington Capitals, 52% rostered. I'll be totally honest, when I started these videos again in 2024, like at the beginning of January, I did a buy low video. Tom Wilson was a second half buy low player, and I was just completely wrong. I'll be the first one to say it. His last 30 days, he ranks 270th in points amongst forwards. 3 points his last 14 games played. Same amount of points as Michael McCarron, Matthew Joseph, Connor Brown. So really bad territory to be in as a fantasy hockey skater. 5 shots on goal his last 6 games, and he's currently playing the fewest minutes per game in the month of January, right around 16 to 17 minutes, which is lower than his season average above 18 minutes. He's also been demoted or put on the third line with Anthony Mantha and Evgeny Kuznetsov. And Kuznetsov, for the last 2 years, we've seen a ton of regression. He's 15 points in 41 games this season with a plus-minus of -13. We've really seen him lose a step here. So if he's playing on a line with Kuznetsov, just an even worse situation for Tom Wilson, who was playing with Ovechkin and Strome for pretty much the majority of the year. He's outside the top 400 in fantasy points scored over the last 30 days as well. That's just not someone you can keep on your roster. There's a guy, as I mentioned, I thought he would bounce back. He showed a lot of promise analytically, but just has not been the case. I think we're really going to see Washington take a big downward spiral here after the All-Star break, considering they have the hardest remaining schedule. And look, I understand if you're in a Cats league, he does a ton in hits. He has 122 hits. He has more hits than he has shots on goal this season. Like, that's a little bit crazy, but if you really need him for hits, sure, keep him on your roster, but he just has so many negative effects to the rest of your categories and roster if he is still on your team. All right, next guy on the list, 43% roster, Travis Sanheim on the Philadelphia Flyers. So pretty solid season for sure. At the beginning of the year, was considered probably the biggest breakout candidate of the season. Last 30 days though, tied 135th in points amongst defensemen. A guy who has 26 points on the season and has had 30-point seasons in his short, young NHL career thus far. 140th in hits over the last 30 days amongst defensemen and 60th in block shots. Has 81 block shots on the season. Definitely his biggest plus in terms of categories. But his last 4 games played, -6, and has just 1 assist in January. A guy that you're not going to want to continue to keep on your roster. Really disappointing over the last 2 months for sure. And the Flyers have a pretty tough remaining schedule, 10th hardest as they come into the home stretch to make their playoff push. Travis Sanheim, he might find his footing defensively and be able to block shots, but in terms of fantasy hockey defenseman, you can drop it. All right, this guy, Andrei Kuzmenko, 43% rostered on the Vancouver Canucks. 42 games played this year, 8 goals and 13 assists. Just a little bit of a step down from last season where he had 39 goals and 30 assists, I believe, in about 70 games. So, you're taking a guy who had 69 or 69 points, and now has barely 20 points through a midway point of the season. And if you look at his last 30 days, it's been abysmal. Last 30 days, tied 310th in points scored amongst forwards. Just 2 points his last 12 games played, and 2 of those points came in 1 game just a couple of days ago as well. He's been a healthy scratch 5 times this year, once in the month of January as well. He's playing 13 minutes per game in January, and most games, to be honest, he's really only playing 10 to 11 minutes. And this team is rolling, so I don't think they're going to be doing too much to really change his production in terms of where they're going to put him on the ice. I know he is playing on that top line right now with Peterson and Mikheyev, but I still don't think that really changes a whole lot. A lot of people have talked about the chance that he gets traded. I don't really see that happening at the deadline, considering his cap hit, $5.5 million, is a lot for teams to take on at this point of the season. And as much as this guy did have 39 goals last season, you just can't roster him. You can't trust him like you did last year. He was definitely due for some regression, considering his shooting percentage last year was 27%, which led the NHL, but I didn't think he would fall off this hard. So you can drop Kuzmenko. I don't think he'll be relevant for the rest of the fantasy hockey season. All right, the next guy we're going to be dropping, also 43% rostered, is actually on the Anaheim Ducks, Mason McTavish. Now I say this because he's probably right on the bubble on a player that you could drop, but there's a lot of players right now that are still in the waiver wire that are less than 40% rostered that are definitely having better stretches than Mason McTavish and even better seasons. He has a decent amount of points over his last 30 days, but still ranks outside the top 240 in terms of fantasy points scored. A lot of that being he plays on the Anaheim Ducks. His plus minus is atrocious. I don't really see Anaheim making any moves at this point of the season. They're not going to trade him either. Right now with the whole Trevor Zegras thing going on this season, the Duck season started off hot, but has really been a disaster since then. Trying to figure out where Leo Carlsson fits in this roster as well as he's on this weight training program. So McTavish, not really going to be fantasy hockey relevant, I think, for the rest of the season. Looking at where he's playing on the roster too now, he was consistently on the top 2 lines, now playing on that 3rd line, still playing a decent amount of minutes, but not enough where I think he can be of value to your fantasy hockey team, so you can drop him. All right, the last guy we're going to be talking about here is Jake Walman on the Detroit Red Wings. 30% rostered right now in Yahoo Fantasy Hockey Leagues, and this guy has definitely been disappointing after his start to the year as well. Very similar to a Travis Sanheim kind of deal here. The biggest thing for Jake Walman, if you look at his month of January, he has no points. His plus minus isn't terrible considering how bad Shayne Gostisbehere is in the month of January, but we're not seeing the same kind of production we saw at the beginning of the year where Detroit was playing, I would say, much better overall, but they're winning a lot more games too. If you look at his first month in October, he had 5 points, 2 goals, was +4 as well, getting a lot more shots on goal than he was at this point of the season too. The one thing Jake Walman continues to do is block shots, top 15 in block shots amongst defensemen over his last 30 days, but also outside the top 80 in terms of points scored with just 4 points over his last 30 days as well. So definitely a guy I would be dropping right now is Jake Walman, not a guy I keep on my roster. All right, thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know what you thought of this week's must drop. Be sure to get rid of these players off your team before play resumes after the All-Star break. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts and comments about these players too, so be sure to drop those in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.